All right, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Bell Curve. Before we jump in, quick disclaimer. The views expressed by my co-host today are their personal views, and they do not represent the views of any organization with which the co-hosts are associated with. Nothing in the episode is construed or relied upon as financial, technical, tax, legal, or other advice. You know the deal. Now, let's jump into the episode. All right, everyone. Welcome back to the real finale of this season of Bell Curve. This is the episode with just Miles and I where we recap the big themes of the season. Miles, it's been a fun season, man. This has been a ton of fun for me. Learned a lot.
It has. It's been fun, definitely not uneventful. Both in terms of things that we may have thought might have happened and a lot of things that we had no idea what would happen, as we saw this week. But building goes on.
It does. Well, it feels a little funny to be talking about this as, we're recording this on March 12th of 23, and we just had USDC depeg and all this crazy stuff. But, I think what's important here is just to focus on what actually happened during this season. And, I think one of the kind of unique things that happened during the season towards the tail end, which forced us to kind of retailor our last two episodes, was I think we did see the AppChain Thesis validated in a pretty big way, in that it actually kind of migrated off of just Cosmos, and we saw it, go into Ethereum. We already were kind of planning on talking about that this season with the Ethereum and Cosmos sort of collision course, but this was validated in a much more explicit way with the sort of rebrand of Optimism to the superchain. And then we also saw seeds of the AppChain Thesis sort of playing out, or Bitcoin and Cosmos kind of coming together. So we kind of had it validated for us about halfway through the season.
Yeah, got a little lucky there. But at the same time, I think that there were a lot of folks building towards this vision in Ethereum when we started. I don't think this was an idea that came out of nowhere. But hearing a few of the biggest projects come out, and really through product announcements, right? Giving us some concrete information on what, they're building towards, and hearing that it's much closer to a future of app specific environments, rather than these basically just L1s that are being recreated at the roll-up level, which didn't make a lot of sense to either of us. And that is a lot of big reason of why we did this show. And to hear that Optimism is building towards this, we brought on the Slush guys with the Calm on. They're building towards, app specific L3s on Starknet. We brought on Sovereign Labs, who's building sovereign rollups that are going to be app specific on Celestia. I think just hearing kind of these common themes across all different sorts of stacks and ecosystems. We didn't even touch on Polygon and, Avalanche and Polkadot, but they've been building towards this as well. So yeah, I think it was in many ways, great to hear a lot of the biggest projects come out and be really vocal about this and sort of validate what we've been talking about, but in a very different way. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we're going to do, I think, during this episode is basically just rehash some of the themes that you and I laid out at the beginning of this season and that we explored in more depth as we were going through the various episodes, the 7 episodes that we recorded together this season. So maybe just starting off with, I think, probably one of the most important ones that we laid out at the beginning, and we asked basically everyone this entire season, was this idea of the spectrum, right? So the kind of full stack app chain over here on the left, then there's the roll app that's set up like a kind of layer 3 roll app solution on Ethereum, and then in the middle, like a more modular roll up architecture like Celestia. And you and I were approaching this from the perspective of a product maximalist, right? So what kind of trade-offs do you have to make from the perspective of an app chain builder, right? If you own everything, the entire full stack over here all the way on the left, or if you surrender, say, consensus or data availability or settlement or something over here on the kind of roll app layer. So let's just start at a high level. Like, what did you sort of, did you kind of change your mind about anything after our interviews this season? Like, what are your kind of thoughts from a product standpoint on that spec?
Yeah, I think one of my most direct questions that I think we gave a few times was, what are things that a independent validator set can do for your product that a sequencer set could not? Um, and I'm not sure if we got the most direct answer that we would have liked all season. But my gut, just based off of everything we heard from folks, is that it's not from the BD perspective of the app chain. It's not that much harder to stand up your own independent validator set than it is to stand up your own independent, distributed sequencer set. And I don't think the hardware costs of a sequencer set are that much different than an independent validator set. I think that if you're going to stand up your own sequencer set or validator set, you might as well do it with your own validator set, because I just don't think the differences are that big. I think the big difference is that if you're standing up a sequencer, if you're standing up a rollup, it's much easier to basically secure that sequencer set or your environment with an existing, layer one token than it is to secure an independent validator set with new native staking token. I think that most rollups will either plug into a single sequencer or a shared sequencer network. That shared sequencer network will secure itself through, a third token. It won't be the token of your rollup. It might be the token of that shared sequencer network, but I have a sense that it's more likely going to be the token of the L1, like ETH, or a mix. And I think that that's where it comes down to. So I think that if you're going to go the rollup route, I think the what you're opting for is for your network to be secured by, a third token, basically not the token of the sequencer set, not the token of your rollup, but of the L1 itself. That's just where I see the puck is going with Eigenlayer and also what we see out of some of the Cosmos area. So I don't think that there's that much of a difference. I do think that you can get more out of for your product if you had your own independent validator set than you could do if you had your own independent sequencer set, if that makes sense.
And for exactly what that is, I think it would be good for listeners if you're interested in going back and getting some of that detail. I think it's probably best to kind of hear from Dave Oha and Sonny. I think Sonny was the episode, and that was the kickoff of the season that he got kind of deep into the weeds on. And those are both the founders of Osmosis, obviously.
Yeah.
And I think,
and also I would just add there Aiden from the last episode, from Stride, which is a relatively new full stack sovereign app chain in Cosmos. They have 100 validators in their active set, but they had 1,000 validators, right? They were in their test net asking to be active set validators. So the demand is there. I'm not saying that demand is scalable to thousands of app chains. I'm saying it's there today. But at the same time, Stride is now moving to, being secured by the Hub's validator set, right? They're not doing that because of a lack of validators wanting to validate their chain or the cost of those validators. They're doing that because by moving to the Hub's validator set, they inherit the security of a major market cap token, which is billions of dollars of security versus their current security, which is in the tens of millions of dollars. And that's the harder part. It's not finding the people to run the hardware. It's not even paying the people to run the hardware. It's the value of that security, what is securing your chain, basically. I think that's the challenging part.
Yeah, I agree. So within that, and one thing that I also think is important to take this particular moment in time, I think when we recorded this series, we were at, call it, peak modular scaling in terms of consensus, because obviously, Ethereum's roadmap, they're the clear winner, let's call it, in the generalized L1 sort of ecosystem. I think there's a lot of consensus around both Ethereum as an asset and an ecosystem, but also as their roadmap kind of making sense, and they embraced kind of the modular approach to scaling. That being said, there probably are some, it's just very early, but there definitely are some benefits, right, to owning your own security budget, later down the line. And we just don't know what those are. So it might be tough to, again, maybe it's not the BD work or the cost of getting those validators for you, but maybe the hard thing, right, is kind of the cold start problem of not having the economic value to secure your network in the beginning. But you could imagine over a greater span of time, if you have the ability to do that, to wait a little bit longer, right, in terms of building that up and owning it yourself, there might be benefits down the line. But I think it's a little too early to really talk about what those are.
Yeah, I think there's some really interesting experiments out there that are looking at, okay, if we can split up the security of our chain by saying we're going to have one token secure X% of our chain and another token secure Y% of our chain. And maybe you start off by having, ETH staking secure most of your chain or all of it, but over time move towards, more and more of your chain being secured by your own staking token. And this is something that we're doing with mesh security as well, where you can basically decide, how much of your tendermint power or how much of, your chain security you're going to afford to another chain's staking token, and how much you're going to afford to those that will restake to your chain. And you could, potentially have a situation where over time you basically own your, start with a small percentage of your chain that you're securing with your own token, but move towards owning your entire security budget and having that control. But only doing so when, your coin is at a market cap that can, responsibly secure that chain.
Yeah, I think that's right. Let's talk about another big concept that we kind of continuously referred to throughout the course of the season, which was this idea of aggregation theory, or maybe said a little bit differently, is the proximity to the customer, the consumer, the user having an enormous amount of leverage. I think in general, Sunny kind of laid that out again in the beginning of the first episode of the season, and then again we dove really deep into it with Sam Hart and Zaki during that second episode. For me, I got pretty red pilled about this idea. It makes an enormous amount of sense to me that if you have access to users, that's going to be an enormous amount of leverage that frankly we haven't had a lot of in crypto yet. I think a really interesting experiment that's going to play out and probably, put this in the forefront of people's minds is Base and Coinbase moving a whole bunch of their users onto their own layer 2. So overall, I think it's good. And I think this also kind of played into when we were talking about in the MEV episode, right? And I think people are kind of waking up to the influence that wallets are going to have in the MEV ecosystem and the order flow auctions that take place in an earlier part of the value chain. But I'm not sure what to say other than I do think that more demand-based styles of investing and kind of proximity to the consumer is going to be a much bigger part in crypto moving forward. I think Cosmos have been talking about that for a while, and they've been exactly right.
I would say that Uniswap is making a really interesting, almost counter argument to the Cosmos approach with their wallet. And I do see these super apps either being, app specific chains that start with one killer app and then expand horizontally within their own app specific chain, or maybe an app that builds a wallet and captures the user with a combination of their brand and wallet, like Uniswap, and then aggregates, either or aggregates or, acquires, in some way gives the users access to more and more products, horizontally. And I get the sense that Uniswap at this point probably is not going to build its own chain. I could be wrong. But they're moving very aggressively towards the wallet being the single point of interaction with the user. And I think that that's one approach. I think that, with Osmosis and other app chains, that is where you are, the application is almost synonymous with the wallet with Kepler. And they're pulling as many other, sort of use cases into their app chain as possible, without diluting the quality of the block space, and also going to the users where they are with their own wallets, right? I think at the end of the day, Osmosis is moving into like MetaMask. It's moving into other wallets, and they don't necessarily think of the user relationship with the wallet. They think of it with the app. Whereas Uniswap, I think, has admitted that the user relationship is with the wallet. That's why they're going to go and compete with, MetaMask. They're going to compete with Coinbase. They're going to compete with OpenSea on the wallet front. So yeah, I think whether the super app is an app chain with a ton of different products that live on the same chain, or whether the super app is a wallet that connects to lots of different apps is still TBD. I think that is, probably one of those questions that's impossible to answer after the season, but we heard a lot of really interesting perspectives that helped us think about it.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's still, MetaMask is obviously the dominant wallet today, but there are, again, Coinbase, they've got their CB wallet, which with the launch of Base could be pretty interesting together. It's very early days for the Uniswap wallet.
One other thing, just MetaMask and Argent, I think, are together because MetaMask and Argent and Phantom maybe are wallet providers, right? Their main product is a wallet, and they're offering access agnostically to this app store of different, products, right? Where everybody else that we've been talking about, whether it's Coinbase or Uniswap, OpenSea, right? They all started with an app and they're moving to the wallet, which I think is an interesting distinction. It will be interesting to see if the winning wallets end up being these apps. I also think that account abstraction will impact this whole landscape significantly. I think we'll have, Coinbase's wallet as a service announcement this week gave kind of a sneak peek into this, right? Where, this whole idea of a wallet provider is very TBD if it will be around, because each application could just be, your own account on that application that you're using, whatever sort of verification process you want, whatever sort of existing application infrastructure or wallet infrastructure you want. I think that this is all, it's still very early, but I would pay attention to. I think account abstraction is one piece of this, AppChain Thesis question that we didn't really get into.
Yeah. You know what else in terms of, what do you think? I used to think of blockchain.com. I actually think they are one of the largest wallet providers. Yeah. I think of them more as,
really?
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah. If you hit their website, I remember they used to advertise themselves more like this, but the world's most popular crypto wallet, over 86 million wallets created. I think of them more as kind of an exchange, to be honest, and more of like OTC and kind of an extender of credit. But I definitely remember they used to advertise themselves that way a lot.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we talked about it on the optimism episode. We talked about BNB a little bit, but we didn't talk about crypto.com and Crow, right? Crow is a I think one of the largest Cosmos app chains. We didn't talk about OKX, which also has a Cosmos app chain. Stay wary of these, centralized exchanges just basically making themselves obsolete because that was their mission from the beginning.
It's definitely interesting. Let's move on to something that you and I talked about a lot, and I think Zachy directly asked this question at the end of the second episode of the season. But I want to talk about this idea of the minimum viable stack. So, one of the only SDKs that kind of has product market fit or escape velocity is the Cosmos SDK, and that's sort of an SDK with building of full stack app chains in mind, right? You've got Tendermint as a form of consensus, kind of out of the box consensus. You've got IBC, that's an enormous part of that as well. So that's the kind of interchain communication. One of the things that I think we were kind of interested in getting an understanding of this season, and for me, this remains one of the biggest questions, is what is the minimum viable stack kind of look like for, let's say, a modular sort of roll up, and then what are the network effects going to be that accrue to the most successful kind of SDK that gets built. And I think that, I'm very interested in getting that question answered. We sort of dug into it a little bit, the episode with Kalman, but I think that was still an unanswered question for me, at least at this point.
I think so. I think this is probably the most, I think everybody who is writing off the Cosmos stack, now that everybody is caught up on the AppChain vision and saying that, Ethereum will out execute and out distribute, I think, they have a lot of valid points, but I also think that a lot of people are underestimating, the network effects of IBC and of the shared, stack in terms of the SDK. I think that there's a chance that all these efforts will be, to make a competing stack will be fragmented to the point that none of them are quite have those, network effects that the SDK does right now. And I think it's basically like, if you're going to do the full stack, which Cosmos SDK did, then you need a consensus and networking engine out of the box, which Tendermint gives you. But for these other stacks, you don't need that. So the MVP of, an app chain stack is much smaller as you go across that spectrum, right? I think what you need at the very least, though, is interoperability and execution. And you need, I think we're seeing with Optimism, we're talking, it's a lot about shared sequencers to be able to recreate the benefits of IBC and interchain accounts within, across rollups. It's shared RPCs. We've heard a little bit about that, which again, I think a lot of these things are creating walled gardens a little bit within each other versus something as generalized as IBC. And then I think, which, still I'm digging into, but the use of ZKs with sovereign rollups and the sovereign SDK stack, I think is interesting and getting closer to what IBC can recreate. But yeah, I think that this one is going to be really hard to answer and really hard. It's just really hard to compare until there is, another competitor out there to the Cosmos SDK stack. I think that nothing has come close at this point. The OP stack and I think Sovereign Labs could be, two of the first. Slush SDK, there's all these components where you need, a lot of mindshare. You need a lot of applications that are interacting with each other to really battle test and prove out demand for the interoperability tools that will eventually come. So yeah, this one's been tough because it's hard to say what the minimum viable stack is and if there is a competitor to the Cosmos SDK, before there is any competitor to it from an app chain stack, perspective.
Yeah, I agree with that. It was interesting doing that episode with Preston and Kalman to get into the business model a little bit of the SDK, which was definitely something that I wasn't super familiar with. And obviously the whole point kind of is that it's open source and available for any of the developers that want to build. But there's a white glove, kind of service offering and a whole bunch of other stuff that you can actually charge for, which I thought was pretty cool. I always love to understand how people make money.
Oh, there's a lot there. Mm-hmm. I think that we also underestimate, a lot of the things in the background, like a block explorer. If the Mint Scan by Cosmos Station has been fantastic in supporting basically every single new IBC chain that pops up. But that is very, very hard to recreate. That is an enormous validator in the Cosmos network that has a lot of incentives to build and sustain something like that. um, anything like that for a new network is going to have to be a public good, basically. Um, and those things are really important, whether it's that or whether it's, validator or sequencer monitoring tools, like all these things that we fund out of the Osmosis Grants Program that are specifically for either the SDKs furtherment or for to help validators. It takes a lot of people that want this service to, rationalize it to be funded as a public good. And I think that a lot of these networks will begin to realize just, how many folks they need helping them in order to stand these things up.
Yeah. Public goods, that's something we dug into last season, actually, in our season of governance. We had a great episode with Nick from ENS, and that was interesting to hear his thoughts on public goods funding. I want to talk to you a little bit about MEV. I mean, the MEV episode was a personal favorite of mine, actually. I loved all the episodes this season, but I thought that one, we really dug into some pretty creative and interesting ideas. I do think this one of the big differences for MEV when it comes to Cosmos. One of the things that I was interested in going into it is there's a product aspect of MEV, which is you kind of laid out in that episode the three perfect solutions, right, for what MEV should be. It's, protecting the user from harmful forms of MEV. There's redirecting funds to the protocol, so that kind of proto-rev module on Osmosis, and then avoiding centralization. So I think one of the interesting things about MEV when it comes to Cosmos, you can have kind of an opinion on how MEV, where and how MEV should be distributed. One thing that I really thought very differently about, actually, kind of after that episode, and even this whole season, was I always thought of MEV as a way to capture some of the value that you generate from your pro. And there's a big economic incentive. I kind of now view MEV as it's one of the it's an inevitable consequence of the way these systems are constructed. And it's not like you go and launch an app chain to capture a whole bunch of value, but instead it's always there. It's more of a byproduct of the way these systems are constructed. And then there's a way that makes sense to distribute that value. And then there's like a bad kind of dystopian way that you can end up redistributing that value as well. So I don't know. What did you think about the discussion around MEV this season?
So I think I hadn't, until we brought Nitesh from DFlow on and talked to him a little bit, I didn't think a lot about the separation of, you know, order flow from block space and how those actually could be two separate but complementary auctions, right? Um, where you capture the order flow from the wallet, but at the same time, the buyers of that order flow need to bid for the ability to settle it and capture the opportunity by buying the block space, right? And so then you could have two separate auctions where you have an auction at the wallet level and you have an auction at the block space level. Kind of led me to believe that, to truly realize this full vision of when people say, you're moving to your own app chain so you can capture MEV. I think if you're actually serious about that, you would need to own the wallet and the app chain to own all of the MEV. And I don't think that's realistic for any app. And so, I think that that's probably overblown. I think that order flow auctions at the wallet level and basically giving back all atomic MEV to the user is going to be a thing. But there is still a ton of value to block space auctions. And there's a ton of value to being an app chain and controlling, how the value of those block space auctions are distributed because, you're not on some general purpose chain with the, validators who aren't interested, aren't aligned with you, right? Or the ones that are receiving that value. So I think that came away thinking that there's still an enormous amount of value today in being able to be opinionated about the ordering of your block space, et cetera, et cetera. I do think in a couple of years that there will be a delineation between, order flow auctions coming from the wallet versus block space auctions that app chains can be really opinionated about. it will be interesting to see, who has the leverage there between the wallets and the apps.
That was a very good takeaway. Nitesh was great on that episode. And I actually thought the point that he made in closing as well, that is probably going to be bigger and bigger, is when the SEC and various regulatory bodies start looking at the way MEV works and these protocols, what definitions do they have around best execution that are going to inform the way that MEV works, as opposed to, hey, like, let's all decide as a community here where this MEV flows to. I think even outside of economic forces and sort of community and social forces, there's definitely going to be a regulatory component here as well. Yeah. So
unfortunately, they tend to get involved.
I think so. Now let's talk a little bit about, the last two episodes were basically is something that we were getting at the opening, but it was a big idea that we wanted to explore in the beginning of, when we first launched this season, which this collision course, as we saw between Cosmos and Ethereum. Obviously, in a lot of ways, the AppChain Thesis was validated by, not that it needed to be validated by Ethereum, but we're seeing it play out, in a pretty frankly interesting and exciting way on Optimism with their whole rebranding of the super chain. I'd be curious what you kind of think about this. Got opinions as well, but
I think that we're starting to see the beginning stages. I think they're laying the foundations. Again, we're not like Base itself is not an app chain. Optimism mainnet, it's not an app chain. I think that there could be a slight nuance between the two visions, where I think I've heard, just from what I'm seeing on Ethereum, it looks like they could be going for something like the L2s are general purpose, but the L3s are app chains. And so you almost launch as an like within that general purpose environment, basically what used to be thought of as an L1, within L2. And then eventually you take the users with you to your own L3. So that might be one nuance versus having, very vertical L2s, each that are their own app. So that's one. Two, I think that it's unclear whether the interoperability standards are going to be siloed within these, networks like the OP network versus the Stark network, right? So is the bridge between Optimism chains, L2s, L3s, whatever, and Starknet L2s, L3s going to be more similar to like the jump from Ethereum to Solana? Or is it going to be more similar to the jump from, an L2 to an L2, or maybe say like a Cosmos chain to a Cosmos chain? I think that's going to take time. So I think you'll see interoperability standards within each existing network, solidified, and then over time, maybe see IBC, something like that, come in to kind of, the different rollup networks. So yeah, I think there's some nuance that they're taking learnings from Cosmos and saying, we're not going to build everything from scratch, but we do have a good sense of like what are the foundations you need to lay down to build a network like this, like an internet of rollups. We heard internet of rollups from Celestia. We heard internet of blockchains from Cosmos, and I forget what the Optimism thing is, but it's something like super chain of chains.
Yeah, super chain. Yeah, I think the risk, not that there has to be, I am very supportive of all kind of ecosystems here. Although we did, we ended up spending, I know you, with your work at Reverie, spend a lot of time in the Cosmos ecosystem. And, I really found myself rooting for Cosmos this season as well, just in doing this season. I think maybe the risk right now is, I think Cosmos is known for a long time that their ideas were on track and correct. I think the risk now is kind of in being out executed by Ethereum, or to tie it back to that idea that you and I have been talking about, being product maximalists. I think Cosmos has done a great job of being product maximalist. The thing is, there's kind of this saying, right, for at least founders, is first time founders think about product, second time founders think about distribution. And I do think Ethereum's done a little bit better in terms of distribution. So
yeah, I will say on the two biggest risks to Cosmos, I love Cosmos. I think that, they trip themselves up sometimes on execution and they don't think about distribution enough. So we'll say on the execution side, uh, everything happens within governance with Cosmos, the full stack for every app chain. And it gets very messy. And there are a lot of voices and a lot of, I would say, potentially conflicts of interests. And it's very difficult to do everything within one forum of governance. On the Ethereum side, there are governance, is fragmented across many layers of the stack, right? And so each governance forum is at least with stakeholders that are all within, focused on that same layer of the stack, right? You don't have like Aave doesn't have validators arguing with app developers, right? Like Osmosis does. You have only people that are focused on the app or focused on the governance of that app, whereas validators and middleware providers are focused on their specific section, right? And I think that this is worth talking about because I mentioned at the first episode of the season, like that the execution risk happens through everything being in governance, in the same governance forum on the Cosmos side. I think that Cosmos's second biggest risk is distribution. I think that there is a sort of, disruptor versus incumbent dynamic here where Cosmos does have the right ideas, but they have to get to distribution before Ethereum realizes that they had those right ideas and recreates them and executes on them. In the same way that a startup, right, would need to basically get to distribution before the incumbent realizes that they can build the same product and get, or at least something close to the same product, right? And so I do think that, I think that basically realizing that distribution is the number one focus for Cosmos, getting retail flow is the number one focus, is probably the biggest risk. Because I don't know, I think that, it's a very ideological community still, which is great, which is the reason that they've continued building, through every single bear market for the last, 5 years, 7 years. But yeah, that's my general takeaway.
I agree with that. And the good news is people love to root for an underdog. Not that Cosmos necessarily is an underdog, but I think there's an enormous amount of consensus around Ethereum right now. And the history of crypto and blockchain would say, like, be wary when an enormous amount of consensus forms around something, because usually it means that there's something else new and exciting that's about to come kick your butt. So, and speaking of exactly that dynamic, let's talk about that last episode that we did, which was again a ton of fun, just talking about the way that Cosmos and Bitcoin might intersect in the future. Yeah. So, basically taking we spoke to kind of the RollKit. We got the RollKit kind of perspective, and then the Babylon chain perspective, both sort of different solutions in terms of what the impact on Bitcoin block space is going to be. But it's basically finding a way to write, read and write directly onto Bitcoin block space. And in the case of Babylon, it's kind of a checkpointing system where you get the timestamp, and you can kind of help secure Cosmos chains that way. And then there's the RollKit, which is basically using data availability on Bitcoin, which is it has a larger footprint, right? Which could be pros and cons, right? It's definitely still limited in terms of what it can do for performance on the app chain side of things, but potentially if Bitcoin were to change its mind and really start inviting stuff that will improve its kind of security budget, then that could be good as well. But I did think the mashup of Bitcoin and Cosmos was a very intellectually interesting one. And I think there's definitely a lot of merit there.
Yeah, I loved it for a lot of different reasons, right? Because Bitcoin is what we call like the original app chain. But I would draw the parallel to rollups, are to Ethereum as like the RollKit is, the sovereign Bitcoin rollup through the RollKit is to Bitcoin. But at the same time, you can also just export the security of your network without necessarily using it for settlement or using it like,
Wait 1 second though. I think that the difference there being is there's no trust minimized bridge for the RollKit on Bitcoin,
that's true.
right?
Right. But you're also sending literally all data down to Bitcoin,
Yeah, yeah, that's
right?
true.
You're not just checkpointing, headers every 5 hours. You're like every single block is being sent down to Bitcoin, and that's the only source of truth for your chain. Versus, and that's similar to like a roll up on Ethereum that sends everything down to L1, right? And it's not a perfect analogy, but with Babylon, I view that as like, you're just you're supplementing your own security with Bitcoin. Whereas with eigenlayer restaking, like you could use eigenlayer restaking to supplement your security of a Cosmos chain, right? You're not using Ethereum as, a critical function of your roll up or of your chain, but you are using it to secure your bridge, your Oracle, your, even Cosmos app chain. Um, I do think that that's an interesting like distinction to bear, because we do view Bitcoin and Ethereum as the two, main security providers, and you can either use them, in the big B sense, right, or you could just use the little b to to help, add security to your chain. So yeah, I think that it's still very unclear, like how important this is going to be, how real it's going to be, how accepted it's going to be by the Bitcoin community. But I love Babylon. I think Babylon's an awesome project. I think that like you're not trying to change Bitcoin. You're just taking what's great about Bitcoin and using it to make something that, is lacking that, right, in terms of the long range attacks on POS chains to basically shore up that hole. I think that that's perfect. I'm not quite sure just how much, Ethereum is going to be able to like secure Cosmos chains through eigenlayer, but I do see that as being very real.
I agree. And I think the point I was trying to drive home there before is just that we're talking about big B Bitcoin in the sense that it's Bitcoin the network, right? And being able to read and write data onto big B Bitcoin the network. But then there's the little B Bitcoin, which is the asset. And I think a critical component that was kind of missing, but is potentially interesting, is a way to transport little B Bitcoin into Cosmos somehow.
Yeah.
Aiden was kind of talking about this when he was describing what's the name is that the alliance kind of.
Nomic. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's the trustless bridge.
No, the way that you might be
Oh, I'm
able to.
sorry. You're talking about Terra's alliance.
Terra's a lot,
Yes.
yeah, which is funny, right? But hear me out here. This is a huge long shot, but when he first described it to me, my initial reaction was, I'm not sure if Bitcoiners are going to want to stake their Bitcoin and get yield in other tokens. But you have to remember that there were platforms like BlockFi, right, that were wildly popular. The people that made BlockFi, the platform that it was, which was very successful for a long period of time, was the Bitcoiners, right, who wanted to get yield on their Bitcoin. And look, it's looking less and less like the U.S. banking system is going to be a hospitable place for Bitcoin. People want to get yield on their assets. This could be, if you could find a way to actually export the little b Bitcoin into into the Cosmos ecosystem, that could be a lot of distribution and users. You might find a larger percentage of the Bitcoiners than you think would be happy to stake it and get yield and do these things. And ordinals are another proof point that these aren't all, Bitcoiners aren't all doomers that, sit in their bunker, with their shotgun and their canned soup. Like these, they love the NFTs. And I think it could be an interesting mashup for sure.
No, I think you could see Cosmos chains secured by some portion of Bitcoin, or obviously some portion of their native staking token. And then the rest of their network is secured by Bitcoin, it's secured by Ethereum, and it's secured by all of the chains that they have very close economic ties with, right? And so you have like a NATO mesh security sort of relationship with those chains, but you're also supplementing it with two very high market cap, low volatility, quote unquote, low volatility assets in those two. Yeah, so I couldn't agree more. I think there's some interesting ideas raised in the alliance. concept, and would also say that, this is not the first time that Bitcoin has found itself in Cosmos. There was that whole, LFG thing quite a while ago.
That's true. That's true.
Which did not necessarily help, but this
Didn't
one
go
might
great.
be the
Didn't go
yeah.
great. Yeah.
This one might be the one.
Well, you know what? The reason why I also just love that Bitcoin episode was, you just mentioned this, but Bitcoin is kind of the original app chain in a lot of ways. And that is not generalized blockchain, block space, right? That's very app specific block space. There was an enormous amount,
very
opinionated on the design of that block space, and the opinions that were right. Yeah, those very specific design choices actually made for app space with very, very attractive properties. So it's just cool. And it leads to an interesting tension, which is, I think Sonny kind of alluded to this and he called it permissioning, but it is kind of interesting to have an app specific blockchain that is also permissionless. Those are sort of oxymoronic if you take a deep look at it, because if it's permissionless, it means anyone can build anything they want. But the whole idea of app specific space is that you don't have NFTs and DeFi competing for the same block space. So that's a pretty interesting tension, frankly.
I think we touched on it, but I don't think we talked about this. So one thing I wish we talked about a little bit more this season, because it is a little bit tough to get into. You either make it explicitly permissioned, where you say like only things that we accept, like through whitelisting and governance, are allowed to be deployed on this chain, or you can make it, implicitly permissioned. Like we talked about quite a while, I think it was the first episode we talked about this, where you can make certain designs so that, certain types of use of your gas, of your block space incurs higher amounts of gas. So it just makes it, incredibly unwelcome to use it for that purpose. Or like we saw with Bitcoin a long time ago, where basically it's saying, the community will come down on you if you use it for anything other than this purpose. And so, explicitly permissioned versus implicitly permissioned, I think that there's a thin line there. But I do think that like pure permissionlessness is at odds with the concept of app chains.
Yeah. Well, I think this was that ended up in Bitcoin. That was kind of like the OP wars, right? There's the OP return function, and there was actually Taproot, which was an upgrade that happened, which reduced it increased the flexibility around sort of witness data on the blockchain that opened all of this up. But that was like kind of an uneasy compromise, is the way that I would kind of describe how Bitcoin landed on that. And it's unclear. It's unclear. I think it has to sort of play out. I actually heard there was, I'm not sure if you know John Adler. He's great. He's one of the co-founders of Celestia, and he's got the Fuel Labs, kind of their EVM. But he was describing a talk that he gave. I didn't listen to the actual talk, but he was describing this talk that he gave at one of the DevCons about almost making changes in the same way that like regulators make changes, like to try to tweak incentives in a system. And, and you could describe, you could look at a lot of the different.
Well, yeah. I think that's where app chains want to go.
Yeah.
I don't think they want this whole whitelisting thing.
I agree.
I think that they would much prefer something that is more implicit like that, agreed upon once by the community, and so that everything else beyond it, is disincentivized or incentivized in that way.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the more interesting dynamics here.
It's a cool analogy to use. So, yeah, I think it was an enormously, fun season. I think we dug into a bunch of really cool ideas, and yeah, buddy, thanks for doing this one. This was a fun one to have you as my co-pilot on. This was a blast.
I had a blast. Yeah. Thanks for listening to me ramble about a whole bunch of stuff.
We should have
a little smarter.
Yeah,
I enjoyed it at least.
Me too, buddy. Me too.
Some things sounded smart. Some things might sound dumb.
Yeah. Okay. Hey, we'll take it. If we got a couple smart sounding things in there, boom, that's good for me. Yeah. It's like golfing, right? When you hit a good drive, you only need one good drive when you're playing golf.
Keep it coming back.
On the way home, you're like, hey, you might have shot 100, but you're like, but that one drive, I really smoked it. So I think we had a couple good drives this season.
One or two good putts.
Yeah,
it's okay. That's all you need. That's all you need.
All right, partner. We can call it.
That was awesome.
This was. All right. Cheers, dude.